And before I introduce our keynote speaker, I wanted to frame, as it were, and put into context the purpose of the keynote address. In a way, you could say that this room today has been one big archaeological site. We've all been on an excavation together, an archaeological dig. We've been working hard, digging deeper and deeper into the historical past, and together uncovering the often hidden roots, the hidden sources, the hidden foundations of freedom in our world. We have gone back very, very far back in time, 2,000 years or so. We've also looked at societies where there is pressure and persecution on Christians today. And beneath the surface, we've seen signs of hope in those societies. We've seen Christians making positive contributions to freedom, to development, even, again, in contexts where they're facing great pressure. So we've been digging beneath the surface, both historically and in the contemporary world. And this evening, we're in fact going to be digging even deeper into even deeper roots and sources of liberty. And to help us in this even more difficult task of archaeological excavation, we have the greatest intellectual Indiana Jones that I know, and that is Ramey Brogg. In thinking about Ramey Brogg's gifts, his achievements, his accomplishments, I confess a famous quotation of Winston Churchill flashed across my mind. Churchill is famous for his quotation about Clement Attlee. He said, "Mr. Attlee is a very modest man. Indeed, he has a lot to be modest about." Well, with Ramey Brogg, it's true, as I've learned with great pleasure the last couple of days, he is a very modest man, a very gracious man, very unassuming man. But as far as his scholarly achievements are concerned, there is every reason for him not to be modest. He has an extraordinary scholarly record. He has been a teacher at the Sorbonne. He currently has a position at the Ludwig Maximilian University. He was professor for many years of medieval and Arabic philosophy at the University of Paris at the Sorbonne. He also holds the Romano Guardini Chair at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. He was educated primarily at the Sorbonne, where he began his career as a student of Greek philosophy. And he became quite accomplished in the study of Greek philosophy. But from there, he was led to study Hebrew in order to read the Old Testament. And he became a profound student of Jewish thought, theology, philosophy. Not content with mastering those two fields, Greek philosophy, Jewish thought, the Old Testament, he turned to the study of Arabic, where he has done much of his important work in the study of Arabic philosophy and thought. So most of his work has taken place at the intersection of the three great monotheistic religions as they developed out of the ancient world and as they formed themselves in dialogue with each other and eventually gave rise to modernity. He's the author of numerous books on classical and medieval intellectual history, books on religion, books on national identity, literature, and law. Among his books are Eccentric Culture, A Theory of Western Civilization, which was originally published in French in 1992 as La Voix Romaine. He's the author of The Law of God, The Philosophical History of an Idea, and numerous other books. In 2012, Ramey Brogg was among the very first two recipients of the Ratzinger Prize, which was given personally by Pope Benedict XVI. Here at our conference, as I said, he will be playing the role of Indiana Jones. He will be going even deeper into the roots of Western liberty, tracing those roots further back than we have discussed today, even deeper deeper than the church fathers, deeper than the New Testament, going back to the Hebrew Scriptures, and he will trace those roots into the very earliest Scriptures, and he will offer remarks that will talk about the depth of these roots in what could be called the Judeo-Christian tradition. So we're very, very grateful and honored to have Ramey Brog. Thank you for being with us, Professor Brog.
Well, I've just mentioned to our common friend this sentence by P.G. Wodehouse, who is one of the deepest thinkers of the former century. He mentions the stupid attitude of the fellow who is sung at in a musical comedy. And I had exactly the same feeling. And when you mentioned, dear Tim, Indiana Jones, I regretted to have forgotten my whip. Well, in any case, I hope you've got my handout. I had prepared 2 pages of the biblical quotations in order to spare me the effort to read texts that are, by the way, rather well known. Well then, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, let me first express my most heartfelt thanks to the people who were so unconscious as to invite me to lecture this evening. Well, I try to streamline the whole stuff. And well, my title, as you know, is God and Freedom. This is, by the way, almost a quotation by a French thinker of the 19th century, Montalembert, a leading figure among the so-called liberal Catholics, but liberal in another shade of meaning than at present. Well, now, biblical roots of the Western idea of liberty. That's my subject matter. Well, now, in order to shed some light on the ideas that are at the center of the present meeting, i.e. Christianity and freedom, I will take my bearings from 2 basic assumptions. The first is that liberty is not a merely political fact. It strikes its roots in a deeper soil, in the very conception of man and of God that underlies a religion, and even in the way each religion conceives of the interplay of God and man in history. The concrete achievements of people who happened to share the tenets of this or that religion are the business of the historian. However, people who considered themselves as Jews or Christians, whether individuals or communities, may not have been faithful to the claims and obligations of their faith. In such cases, the historian will have to borrow the standards which they failed to live up to from another field of inquiry than mere historical narration. Hence, it is not enough for us to tell the story of the achievements and shortcomings of Jews and Christians in giving liberty a concrete dimension through their social institutions. We will also have to climb upwards to the level of principles, which are theological in nature. So far, my first assumption. My second assumption is that the idea of liberty was not a sudden invention springing into existence out of the blue as part of the great intellectual revolution that we know as the Enlightenment. Although the Whig conception of history interprets the call for liberty as some kind of break with Christian ideas and ideals that allegedly held sway over the Middle Ages, this view is far from the truth. For Western liberty is a far older tradition, the sources of which are to be looked for, first and foremost, in the medieval period. And we've heard a great deal about that this morning. Lord Acton, in the essays in which he summarized the history of liberty that he most regrettably never completed, already could point this out. More was done after him by students of the medieval legal tradition and of the conflict between the papacy and the empire, in which both sides, interestingly, chose as their catchword libertas, i.e. freedom. Libertas ecclesiae, on the side of the Pope, libertas ecclesiarum, in the plural, on the side of the emperor. Now, I would like to go further back to the very foundations of the medieval worldview, i.e. to the sacred books of the Bible. We will find there the common ground of Christianity and Judaism. The books known to the Jews as the Tanakh and to the Christians as the Old Testament, or better, as the First Testament. These books remain the core of what we call rather clumsily, for want of any better term, the Judeo-Christian heritage. The hyphen between Judeo and Christian is quite problematic. I will deal with the New Testament in a more summary way, but I will take those two books, the First and the New Testament, in chronological order. First things first, and then the New Testament. And from time to time, I will compare their content with what matches it in the Quran, a book which draws upon some biblical stories, but I will underline the peculiarities of the two sets of texts, i.e. the Bible on one side and the Quran on the other one. As a consequence of my first assumption, I won't even mention the passages from both testaments that deal with social phenomena in which liberty and the lack thereof were involved. And for instance, the laws on slavery. You've heard, I wasn't there, I was working at my stuff. Slavery was in the ancient world a common practice. It was part and parcel of the economic system, and few people ever thought of criticizing it, let alone abolishing it. In the city of rebellious slaves led by Spartacus, there were still slaves. Little wonder that the Bible does not say anything totally revolutionary about it, but contents itself with advocating a more humane treatment of slaves. Now, as far as the Old Testament is concerned, we should not expect to find in its writings anything resembling a philosophical concept of freedom. First, because there are no concepts in the Hebrew Bible. Deep thinking is there in plenty, but ideas are there under the guise of narratives. Second, because wherever liberty is mentioned, it means, as I told you, a social status, i.e. the status of people who are not slaves. And the same thing holds true, by the way, of Greek philosophers. Philosophers for whom freedom meant the condition of a self-governing city, and also that of their citizens who, unlike slaves, were owners of themselves. The metaphysical idea of free will is hardly older than the fathers of the church, and it owes its first clear statement to St. Augustine. At the same time, however, I claim that an important idea of freedom is implicit in many Old Testament passages. I'll have only to make them explicit, to make this idea, explicit, in order to perceive its closeness to our thinking today. But now, let's begin with the beginning, i.e. with creation. God, I contend, created three beings, and this is one of the deepest meanings of the narratives about creation. When ancient Israelite sages reflected on the absolute beginning of all things, they put freedom at the center of the relationship between God and the world. The first narrative of the creation, right at the beginning of our Bibles, culminates in the following words. That's passage number 1 on your handout. And I will focus on and God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. That's King James. Obviously, this is a way for the sacred writer to explain and legitimate the rule of the sabbatical rest. It is grounded on the story according to which God too rested after his work, as you have in the second passage on your handout. The Sabbath is free time, time for leisure, for free activity, i.e. for the activities that become a free man. The ancient thinkers who lived in societies of slaveholders drew a line between what becomes a free man and what some people are compelled to do in order to keep things going, tilling the soil, building houses, weaving garments, cooking meals, and so on and so forth. They named the later group of activities servile, i.e. slavish activities, whereas the former, which alone were worthy of free people, deserved the name of liberal studies or liberal arts. Now, the biblical narrative of creation makes possible a leisure that encompasses everybody, not only slave owners. The Bible stresses the fact that the servants too are to be granted a day of rest. That's in the passage number 3, what I have underlined. The rest of the Sabbath holds true for thy manservant, thy maidservant too. This is what I should call the social dimension of the Shabbat. It was a thin wedge whereby liberty could enter ancient societies. Yet there is more to it. The Shabbat has another, deeper dimension that we could call, with your permission, a metaphysical dimension. When the Bible describes God as withdrawing from his work in order to have 40 wings, God is described as free. But the world too is, so to speak, free from God's action, and is allowed to rest in itself. God does not interfere anymore with what he has created. On the contrary, he somehow sets his creatures on a free footing. His providence gives them whatever is required for them to be able to shift for themselves in the pursuit of what is good for them. The necessary kit, the toolbox that enables a creature to reach its own good, is what we call its nature. The biblical God does not create bundles of independent properties that he arbitrarily puts together or asunder. He creates things that are endowed with natures. To be sure, God keeps whatever exists in being, for without his continuous will to maintain them, they would disappear. But he respects the nature of the things that he has created. By this token, something like freedom already exists at an elementary level, even before freedom becomes conscious of itself in human beings. Human freedom expresses in a human key a property that belongs to each creature. Now, interestingly, the Quran, which repeatedly praises God's creative activity, does not mention the rest of the seventh day. As a consequence, it does not contain any law on sabbatical rest. A verse even discreetly criticizes the idea that God could get tired. Mainstream Islamic apologetics, the so-called Kalam, later in the 9th century, built a whole worldview in which things and even time consist of indivisible units or properties that stick together simply because God creates them afresh out of nothing in every instant. Such properties don't belong together because they express the nature of a thing, but merely because God has the habit of combining them. Now, to be sure, the biblical worldview too agrees in putting God above any fatigue, and the New Testament insists that God does not stop working. But what God keeps going is things that are endowed with a stable nature and spontaneously, freely act in accordance with it. Now, the God of the Bible does not only leave freedom to his creatures, for some of those creatures lead a historical life. This is the case of our humble selves. When this is the case, God does not only leave them free, but sets them free by stepping into history. Liberty comes to the fore right at the beginning of Israel's history, such as the Israelites understood it. Liberty is the very definition of the people of Israel as the people of the Exodus. Israel, to be sure, is not the only people that a divine being is supposed to have led from a former abode or state of nomadic wandering to its present place of permanent residence. On the contrary, this was considered as a common phenomenon. Migrations were seen as the work of God's hand. Just have a look at text number 4. Israel was led from a place to another, better one, that God emptied of its former inhabitants. Now, God did exactly that for the neighboring nation of the Edomites, too. See passage number 5. Yet, the history of Israel has a peculiar feature insofar as it is the story of a liberation. The conquest of the promised land is the last episode in a process that leads the people to an independent life. The people is said to have been freed from a state of captivity they suffered in Egypt. Whether this matches a historical fact or not is scarcely relevant. Probably some Israelite tribes at some point of their history fared badly with their civil servants while in Egypt, and perhaps they had to depart in haste. And this was later on generalized to the whole nation. But what is important for my present purpose is the kind of experience of God that is implied in such a narrative. Just have a look at what we call the Decalogue. When God introduces himself to his people, to his chosen people, he does what we do when we first tell our name, then the trade we ply. Well, my name is Jones and I am a dentist. That's exactly what he does in the passage number 6. I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. God's job, so to speak, consists in setting people free. Now, it is the case that this introduction, this way for God to introduce himself, explains the meaning of what follows, i.e. the famous Decalogue. We commonly translate as 10 commandments, but the word means more exactly 10 utterances. For the very first one that I have just been quoting is not a commandment, but a self-description. Yet it provides us with a key for us properly to understand the so-called commandments. For those commandments are what I should call the code of the free people. Those commandments, be they positive or negative in nature, are not expressed with the imperative particle, do this, don't do that. They are expressed with a particle that invokes or negates a future tense. Thou shalt do this, or thou shalt not do that. And perhaps we should somehow take grammar more seriously than it deserves and understand the commandments as real future forms. For they are the logical consequence of the liberation wrought by God. If I'm right, we have to understand, since you are now free people, you won't have to do anymore what slaves do, i.e., you won't kill, you won't steal, and so on and so forth. The word commandment, and that's the snag about it, the word commandment has a ring of submission. But the Decalogue is not about submission at all. What we call the laws are the codification of liberty. They don't limit freedom by setting rules that we are not allowed to trespass. For abiding by the law is nothing more than remaining faithful to the logic of liberation. Abiding by the law is taking what consists in taking one's freedom seriously and drawing whatever consequence it can have. In fact, the so-called commandments are something like the code of honor, the Bushido, of free people. The code of honor of gentlemen who are aware of what is not done. A gentleman is a person who knows what is not done. Just think of Roderick Spode, a Poka Sahib who plays the game and does not do things that are not done. So Bertie Wooster. With some irony, we could even interpret many features of the Ten Commandments in the light of aristocratic ethics. A gentleman doesn't bow down to a graven image nor serve it. A gentleman doesn't tell fibs. A gentleman doesn't toil all the time, but grants himself and his manservant, his gentleman's gentleman, a day of rest. Jeeves has his day off, and that's why he can go a shrimping. A gentleman honors his lineage. He's faithful to his ancestors. Just think of Blandings Castle and the large gallery of ancestors. A gentleman doesn't mingle in dirty business like killing, betraying one's wife, or pilfering. A gentleman does not even stoop to look at other people's property. That's, in my opinion, the way, with a smile to Bishop, the way in which we should read the Decalogue. Only one thing is lacking, not wearing a tie of the wrong college, but that's another story. And not shooting a sitting bird, to be sure. On the other hand, the liberty that the people of Israel enjoys is not the license of the aristocratic libertine. For the trouble with born gentlemen is that Even if they indulge in the most shameful vices, they will do so with perfect grace and propriety, like Mozart's Don Giovanni, never losing their exquisite distinction and manners. As a consequence, they won't be that particular about morality. Even if they play the game, they won't take such things too seriously, as soon as nobody of their peers is watching. But on the other hand, people who retain the gnawing consciousness of being, at the end of the day, mere upstarts, will normally react by behaving in a more gentlemanly way than real gentlemen. They will even slightly overdo things just to be on the safe side. We can spot something like that in ancient Israel, especially among the prophets. And this explains why Israel's past liberation from Egypt is constantly brought to memory as a gift, so that liberty can't be separated from the consciousness of a former bondage. This unpleasant remembrance is even almost harped upon. See passage number 7, and remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and so on. This has consequences on the behavior which is expected of the Israelite towards foreigners. Passage number 8, thou shalt neither vex a stranger, and so on, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Since liberty is nothing natural, nothing innate, but something that was vouchsafed by God, being born a free man loses its relevance. And the difference between true blue Israelites and the others is played down. See the text number 9. The stranger that dwelleth with you shall be unto you as when born among you. And again, for you were strangers, and so on. And text number 10 says very much the same thing. Hence, biblical liberty is not peacefully enjoyed by a privileged caste. It exists in a dynamic dimension. It must be shared with other people and expanded to the whole of mankind. Freedom, this kind of freedom, introduces a dynamism of liberation. The Bible generalizes aristocratic ethics to a people in its entirety. Now, this may have something to do with a fact that had momentous consequences on Western political theory. In the Bible, the legitimacy of monarchic rule was always implicitly qualified and often explicitly attacked. Such a critical stance over against monarchy was a new phenomenon. For in the ancient world, we find, to be sure, from time to time, some critiques leveled at this or that concrete ruler. For instance, more than one Roman emperor was portrayed by Tacitus as a bloodthirsty tyrant and lampooned by Suetonius because of his disgusting sexual practices. And we find reflections on the respective value of the various political regimes, for instance in Herodotus, who reports the discussion that allegedly took place in Persia between the supporters of the three regimes, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, after a revolution did away with an impostor. And this discussion, well, the upshot of it was the choice of monarchy. Now, the Bible is the only ancient text that contains a critique of monarchy as such, not of this or that concrete king, and not as pitted against another political system. That's the first book of Samuel, chapter 8. The only legitimate rule is supposed to be God's direct rule. This is not a claim in favor of theocracy, if we mean thereby the rule of priests over lay people. It actually was a theocracy, if we are to follow the first author who coined the term, i.e. Josephus, who says, well, Moses' law was a theocracy. To the contrary, far from being the rule of priests over lay people, this is an appeal to everybody to behave as a priest, since Israel is a nation of priests. Now I shift to another theme that might be the consequence of what I've just been telling you up to now. The way in which God behaves with his people shows that the Lord himself respects the freedom of his creatures. This comes to the fore in a scene that several prophets, among the most ancient, repeatedly put on stage. The God of Israel is supposed to have with his unfaithful people a lover's tiff, and even to bring a lawsuit, in Hebrew, a riv, against them. This is the case in Hosea, a prophet of the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century. That's text number 11. And Isaiah, text number 12, says very much the same thing. Now you'll observe, if you have a look at both texts, that the reasons for God's wrath and desire to litigate with his people have nothing to do with God's own interests. Suppose this could make any sense. Has God interest to defend? But it has very much to do with the good of those who most urgently need protection, i.e. the poor. God does not work for himself. He's not upset by, say, lack of respect for one of his priests, as this happens at the beginning of the Iliad in Homer. This is what triggers the whole story, by the way. God defends man. Let us have a closer look at a passage, that number 13, from another prophet from the 8th century, a prophet from Judah. Bless you. Hear ye now, and so on. Arise, contend thou before the mountains, and let the hills hear thy voice. Hear ye, O mountains, the Lord's controversy, and ye strong foundations of the earth. For the Lord hath a controversy with his people, and he will plead with Israel. O my people, what I have done unto thee, and wherein have I wearied thee? You'll have identified the sources of what Christians sing on the Good Friday. On Good Friday, the so-called improperi. Now, you'll have observed that the powers of nature are called to witness. They are described according to the worldview that prevailed at that time. The earth is seen as a flat surface posited on pillars. Moreover, the idea of mountains listening to God's plea is not to be taken literally either. But discarding all this as simply obsolete would let an important element go. And this element is that God and the people are not facing one another directly. There is a third character in the drama. In this case, the part is played by mountains, by the hills, by the primeval abyss. We would call this by a name that is lacking in the Old Testament, i.e. nature. But now, the very presence of a third instance suggests that we have entered the realm of law. The dimension of the juridical begins where two people, instead of fighting, become litigants who contend in the presence of a third neutral person. And what is the third element here? As an image, nature. mountains, primeval waters, and so on. But the real third element here is the fact that God argues with his people on the basis of commonly received moral principles. And those principles are not simply what God happens to will. They are not presented as commands. They obtain by what later thinkers again will call nature. There exists a common ground of what George Orwell called basic decency between God and man. This is a ground on which man can stand even without an explicit knowledge of the God of Israel. And now this is precisely what Hosea in text number 11 calls knowledge of God. The word God there has capital letters for the translators only. But knowing God or fearing God means hardly more than abiding by the rules of common decency. Well, this is, for instance, what happens in Genesis 20, when Abraham has to lie to the king Abimelech in order not to be killed because of his beautiful wife Sarah. And when Abimelech asks him after that, well, how is it that you behave that way? He answers, well, I thought there was no knowledge of God in this country, i.e. no rules of basic decency according to which, well, we should not sleep with the wife of our neighbor. Interestingly, the Quran does not mention such scenes. The recurrent pattern in the Quran is God sends a prophet to a human group and commands that something should be done or avoided, not killing the sacred camel, she-camel. The prophet is not obeyed. The disobedient group is utterly destroyed by some device, a strong wind, an earthquake, a flood, and so on. To be sure, many contradictory discussions between the prophets and their people are reported, but none takes place between God himself and the prophets whom he sends. Exchange takes place only between beings that exist on the same level, i.e. human beings. God in the Quran does not accept to descend, to lower himself to the level of created beings. Hence, he does not admit any bargain with him. Little wonder, as a consequence, that Abraham's famous haggling with God about the fate of Sodom should be quickly alluded to, but not really told. And in the Quran, that's in the 11th surah, Abraham tries to negotiate with God, but God rebukes him rather coarsely and tells him more or less to go and boil his head. Let us now read a well-known poem by Isaiah. That's passage number 14. Well, it's well known, the story of this fellow who planted a vineyard and was waiting for the vineyard to produce, well, edible grapes and good wine, and the contrary happened. The content is evidently allegorical in nature, and the verses that follow set forth the meaning in all clarity. God's vineyard is the country of Israel. The vine is the people. The fruit stands for the latter's deeds, be they good or bad. Now, the whole passage belongs to the literary genre that I have just characterized as the lawsuit between God and his people. the Israelites are summoned to judge between God and the vine, i.e., between God and themselves. Their guilt is the same as in the passages that I quoted above. It's moral in nature. They have denied justice, they have taken bribes, and so on. What I should like to focus on, however, is the very attitude of God. He does not command the vine to produce good grapes. Producing good grapes is what the vine is expected to do. God looks that, which means he's waiting for good grapes. And he's doing that because this is what a vine, when it is properly looked after, normally, spontaneously, freely does. And to come back once again to the non-biblical word, it is the nature of the vine to produce grapes and not bananas. In the same way, God does not, properly speaking, command righteous moral behavior. How one should behave is already a matter of common knowledge. This can be brought back to the memory, but not taught, properly speaking. To quote another prophet, we already know, number 15. I have chosen the version, the Masorah. The Septuagint has another interpretation. Not he hath shewed thee, but one hath shewed thee, i.e., the origin of this knowledge of good and evil is not a special revelation by God, but it is written in our hearts. God expects such a behavior to spring, such a just behavior to spring forth from something like human nature, and to do that freely. Here I must insist for a while on this dimension of hope. God hopes. This is what the Hebrew verb tells us, by the way. God hopes, God waits with bated breath that man should be just, kind, loving, and so on, and that he should do that, should be that way freely. There is another scene that tells us a great deal about the ways of the biblical God with man. In Genesis, God is looking, that's well known, God is looking for a convenient mate for the newly created Adam. He makes the animals and brings them to Adam. You remember that none filled the bill, so that God had to create Eve. But before that, Adam gives the various animals names. And what is extraordinary is that God waits and accepts to learn those names from man. Most interestingly, again, the Quran has an analogous scene, but everything is put upside down. In the Quran, God teaches man the names of the animals, and not the other way about. Well, let's now deal shortly with the New Testament. The New Testament takes for granted a knowledge of the whole content of the Old One. But it was written in cultural surroundings that, unlike ancient Israel, were familiar with philosophical thought. The Greek in which it was written knows the word for freedom, eleutheria. Therefore, I will give the New Testament short shrift, because it would be too easy to expatiate on concepts that are there black on white. Nevertheless, freedom is there in the New Testament not only where the word is present, but also where it is not, and those passages might be more interesting than the ones in which the concept is explicitly there. So that I will slur over the passages in which the word eleutheria is present and be more talkative over the passages in which it is not. Jesus' death that took place on Easter Eve and his resurrection are thought of on the model of the former Easter, on the model of Israel's liberation from Egyptian bondage. Jesus' death is a new Exodus. When Luke's Gospel tells us about the Transfiguration on the Mount, it explains that Jesus spoke with Moses and Elias about his departure, and the word used is the Greek exodus, in a clear allusion to the first Exodus. Jesus' passion is conceived of as setting man free from a captivity that affects man more deeply than the one the people experience in Egypt, i.e., the shackles of sin. Sin can be and has been conceived of by philosophers and religious people in various styles, as offending God, as trespassing against a rule, as sullying the purity of our soul, as increasing the burden that keeps us chained to the wheel of reincarnations, and so on and so forth. Now, the New Testament sees sin first and foremost as a weakening of our own liberty. Liberty is the goal of the liberation wrought by Christ rather than the means by which it was obtained. Number 16, the King James Version that I've quoted here chose to parse the sentence in a certain way, but the Revised Standard Version has more literally, "For freedom Christ has set us free." The ultimate aim of such a liberation is not leaving one master and falling prey to another one. It is the full expression of what one naturally is. This is the free development of what we were originally meant to be. The ultimate goal of salvation, mankind's ultimate hope, is conceived of as total freedom, hence passage number 17. Nevertheless, as a conclusion, that's my last part. You can be quiet. A passage from Paul draws the whole picture of the way in which God respects freedom in his dealings with man. It is the grandiose beginning of the epistle to the Ephesians, text number 18. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who hath blessed us with all spiritual blessings in heavenly places en tois ep uranios in Christ, according as he has chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, procatabolis cosmo, that we should be holy and without blame, and so on and so forth, having predestinated us unto the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself. Now, the originality of the New Testament outlook becomes still more spectacular when we compare this passage with a verse from the Quran, that's number 19, last. And remember when thy Lord brought forth from the children of Adam from their reins their seed, and made them testify of themselves, saying, I am not your Lord. They said, Yea, verily, we testify. That was lest you should say at the day of resurrection, Lo, of this we were unaware. The common point between those two passages is the fact that the scene is supposed to have taken place before the creation of the world, or at least before the creation of mankind, and in the highest heavens, outside of and above the time and space of our everyday experience. That's the common point. The big difference lies in man's answer. To be precise, in the way and in the time in which this answer is given. In the Quran, The answer is given immediately afterwards by Adam's posterity, miraculously put in its entirety in front of God. The whole of mankind has pledged allegiance to its Creator, even before it actually came into being. This has positive and negative consequences. Let's begin with good news. Positively, every son of Adam, i.e. each and every human being, is one who has submitted to God, in Arabic Muslim, from the outset. Islam is supposed to have been the original religion of mankind. In spite of the reluctance of mainstream Islam to accept the idea of nature, one could venture to say that Islam conceives of itself as some sort of natural religion. On the other hand, according to a frequently quoted utterance of Muhammad, a hadith, children are born according to their innate character. There's a difficult Arabic expression. My translation is rather a makeshift one. The other religions, like Judaism, Christianity, or the religion of Zoroaster, are foisted upon the children by their parents. But Islam has not to be brought to the child. He already is Muslim. Islam is the religion into which each child is born. This explains why no formal act of joining the community of believers, such as the Christian baptism, let alone catechism, is required. It is enough to surrender to evidence and to acknowledge God's exclusive lordship. On the negative side, disobedience cannot be excused. The lack of submission, the lack of Islam to God's will is not tough luck, not an error, not a simple moral failure. It is kind of a treason. It involves falling away from a religion that is the natural and original religion of mankind. Not only does Islam forbid apostasy, therefore, as an inexcusable offense, it has even a tendency to regard the adherents of other faiths as already apostates from Islam, from this pre-eternal Islam. Let us now go back to the epistle to the Ephesians. There, a question is implicitly asked. Will mankind accept God's benediction and the whole plan of salvation that it implies? The answer is not given. To be sure, God expects that man will react positively and accept the offer. God sort of hopes that man will say yes and enter in communion with him, in the same way as the peasant of Isaiah hopes that his vineyard should produce good wine. But in the time that stretches before the creation of the world, nothing whatsoever takes place except God's initiative. What actually happens, including any possible answer of man, does so in history. History is the very answer to God's question. But it is an open answer. Nobody knows whether the answer of mankind will be, in the long run, positive or negative in nature. We can only hope with Lady Julian that all manner of things will be well. But history, as we experience it, is the stage on which the drama of liberty is played. My conclusion at present: what cultures that were influenced by the Jewish and Christian religions made of the ideas that I have been finding in both testaments, this is a task for historians. They will not be at great pains to measure the time lag that separates the original bestowal of freedom and its fulfillment in social institutions. And impartial historians will observe how miserably the ideal and its realization often jarred with one another. On the other hand, they will have to acknowledge that free institutions hardly ever developed in places that were not influenced by Jewish and Christian ideas. Outside the Judeo-Christian tradition, it has been rare for thinkers to suppose that God endowed us with a nature of our own, that freedom is part of that nature, and that it is through the exercise of freedom and the errors that inevitably stem from it that we fulfill God's plan. The mainstream tradition of Islam has certainly regarded freedom, both personal and political, as important, but it considered it as valuable mainly as a means to ensure accountability, i.e. to ensure that actions should be ascribable to their agents, hence that those agents should be rewarded or punished in a fully just way. My last words will consist in a quotation from Lord Acton. The quotation is quite famous, by the way. Liberty is not a means to a higher political end. It is itself the highest political end. And now Lord Acton is echoing voices that can be heard in all the sacred books of our tradition, from the Torah to the epistles of St. Paul. Thank you for your attention. Minutes.
That was a marvelous tour de force. We invite questions and comments. Please, as we've said before, identify yourself if you'd like to make a comment or question. We have about 30 minutes or so for discussion. Yes, please turn on your microphone. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm a student at the Angelica. I'm a Russell Berry Fellow in Interreligious Studies. I have probably a simple question, but I was just wondering what you make of, in the Islamic tradition, I think the TA from my class is here, so don't, if I get it wrong. I think Al-Miraj, when the story of Muhammad's ascent into heaven, and he has an argument with God regarding the number of prayers said. So I was just wondering how that kind of fits in with the structure that was laid out.
Well, I, honestly speaking, don't make a great deal of that. For, I mean, the relationship with the idea of freedom in that is scanty. Yeah? Well, what happens in this story is some sort of legitimation of an idea that is frequently uttered in the Quran, i.e. that the commands that are, that come from God and that are supposed to be executed by the people are light. They are light. The Islam understands itself as steering a middle course between too difficult a religion and too easy, let's say, too lax a way of acting. And now, the whole, this might be true. You could imagine that man should spend his or her whole time in prayer or should fast for 12 months. And you can always say, well, that's not that bad. It should be worse. But this, this remains caught in the overall framework of a religion based on a system of law. If the content of religion is not, let's say, access to God, to put it in, well, I can't find any better phrase right now, off the cuff. If the content of religion consists only in commands and interdictions, then it's very much in our interest that there be few commands and few interdictions for things to be simpler than what they are. And by the way, this story has a great deal of equivalence in the Jewish tradition, not only among the sages of the Talmud, but in the Jewish jokes as well. Moses negotiating and telling his people, okay, I had a tough time with this fellow up there, but I could reduce the number of commands to up to 10, but unfortunately the sixth is still there. Okay, but this remains inside of a certain conception of what a religion should be. And for this reason, I think that, this way for people to conceive of what a religion is and should be has hardly anything to do with the idea of freedom. What I've tried to show is that what we call by the name of commands are to some extent, and the ambiguity of the word law perhaps should be paid attention to, i.e., the laws, the content, the laws that contains some commands is at the same time the expression of the deep nature of a being. I.e., there are some common points between the idea of law in the juridical meaning and the idea of a law of nature. What we are commanded to do is what expresses our deepest or our best or our highest, depends on the kind of image that one prefers, that's the deepest layer or the highest level of our own nature. That's not some things that we receive from the outside. You know? Thou shalt do that, and if you don't do that, I'll spank you.
This is probably a really basic question, but if towards the end you are saying that Islam conceives of itself as an original natural religion, then how do Muslims explain the fact that it was developed or formed or whatever one calls it after Judaism and Christianity?
Well, that's quite a good question, but the answer must be sort of contradictory, because the reality is contradictory at the same time. You know, Islam understands itself as being a way for the last prophet, i.e. Muhammad, to bring back to the memory of mankind a message that had been given to mankind, right at the beginning. When we ply the trade of history, we say, well, Islam appeared in, say, 622. Well, that's the date in which Muhammad changed places, and he went from Mecca to where he was rather unsuccessful, to Medina, in which he was very successful. Well, but according to Islamic self-understanding, Islam is as old as the creation of mankind. And Islam was, for instance, which is, by the way, quite important if we want to understand something about Islamic-Christian dialogue, Islam was the religion of Abraham. Abraham was a Muslim. This is what the Quran says. Well, of course, this involves an anachronistic understanding of the participle Muslim. The verse of the Quran means simply he was submitted to God, or more precisely, he surrendered himself wholeheartedly to God. This would be a better translation than submitted. Anyway, Abraham was a Muslim. Before him, Noah was a Muslim, Adam was a Muslim, after him, Moses was a Muslim, Jesus was a Muslim. What happened with Muhammad is that, thank goodness, the message was not tampered with in the same way as it was doctored by the Jews and the Christians, who had received basically the same message under the name of Torah and under the name of Injil before Muhammad. But with Muhammad, a message, the content of which was very much the same, arrived and remained safe. And that's why Islam, according to Islamic self-understanding, to be sure, and we have to respect that and to take that into account when we try to discuss with Muslims, Islam is at the same time the oldest religion and the youngest and the last one. It is the last reminder of the oldest tradition. Okay, this makes things not exactly simple, but I think that's the way we can understand this religion, you know. And for this reason, it's not contradictory to say that, a religion that was old, even older than Adam. Well, I had to streamline the passage on this verse of the Quran, which is to be found, by the way, in the 7th surah, verse 172. 772. There's a word of art to describe this verse. The idea is that Adam's whole posterity is miraculously drawn out of his, let's be euphemistic, out of his loins, to use the biblical euphemism. And okay, you have the whole spectrum of mankind, you know, is in front of God, and God can ask this huge assembly of people, "I am your Lord." And what is interesting in the scene, that's the answer is given, so that when we recede from this original affirmation of the sovereignty of God, for instance, if we associate, if we add to the unique God other beings, and this is the way in which Islam understands Trinity. Well, that's not the way Christianity understands it, but we have to take this into account. Then we sort of betray our original, or our pre-eternal faith, our pre-eternal confession of faith towards God. And for this reason, we are sort of apostates. This, by the way, doesn't make an interreligious dialogue easier, because, the Muslim could very well tell us, I won't put it that way. Let me tell you a story, a real story about the former Colonel Gaddafi. He was invited to Paris by our former president. Well, it was part of a give and take in order to get the liberation of those Bulgarian nurses or something like that. Perhaps Sarkozy had other reasons. But anyway, he went to Paris and held a conference in front of a great deal of journalists, and not only journalists, but all kind of big fish, ambassadors and experts of all kind. And he said, well, you imagine that you are Jews or Christians, but you are wrong. You are wrong because the sacred books you rely upon were falsified. They were not the books that were entrusted to Moses and to Jesus. The content of those books is in the Quran. As a conclusion, the real Jews and the real Christians, that's we, Muslims. And well, Gaddafi perhaps was not a top-notch theologian, but he expressed what is to be found, let's say, in Islamic consciousness. I don't say in each and every Muslim, but well, that's not an exception, you know. That's a common way for Islam to understand itself, and for this reason, a dialogue between, let's say, Christians and Muslims could be seen from the point of view of those Muslims as a dialogue between real Christians, i.e. the Muslims, and alleged Christians, i.e. the Christians. But it's not that easy. Yeah?
Would you say there's anything in Islam which corresponds to the Christian reading of man being created in God's image?
Well, there is nothing like that in the Quran, but as you know, as you know, the Quran is only a small part of the documents on which Islam relies. In particular, Islamic law has few props in the Quran. You can find something about penal law, about inheritance law, about marriage and things like that, and that's it. And the rest has to be deduced from the declarations of the Prophet Muhammad, i.e. from the so-called hadith. And this is a huge corpus of traditions. And in the hadith, there is a declaration that resembles a great deal the idea of a creation of man as the image and resemblance of God. But unless I'm very much mistaken, I'm in deep waters there, it is interpreted as meaning that a man has the most beautiful appearance, the most beautiful form and things like that. But the idea according to which we could sort of climb up from the image to the original by use of what we call analogy, well, the idea is not welcome in Islam. You know, God remains outside of any reach.
It's interesting that you quoted in number 6 the beginning of the Decalogue, which you rightly said are not 10 commandments but 10 statements. The usual interpretation, even for many in the Jewish tradition, is that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Look what I've done for you, therefore you owe me one. You're indebted to me. It is a chovah, it is a debt. And of course, since God is infinite and we're finite, the debt can never be repaid. I suspect that some of that image of the law as our indebtedness crept into Paul's statements at times. However, another interpretation is that what God is saying to the people, I brought you out of the land of Israel, that was an act of grace, and the giving of the commandments is a further grace. In other words, that basically I'm enabling you to have a relationship with me. and that therefore this is not calling in a debt, but rather an empowerment, an entitlement, as it were. And that gives an entirely different notion, and very much in the Jewish tradition. The law is grace, and the law is something shared by God. God resting on the Sabbath day. Well, it's the Sabbath day right now. And therefore, God rested on the Sabbath day. Therefore, when humans observe the Sabbath, they're not repaying God. They're sharing with God in something that God has enabled them to share as an act of grace, of mutuality. And that creates an interesting thing. But I suspect that in Christianity, there's at times a certain ambivalence, because Paul himself is ambivalent about whether the law is actually a burden or the law is grace. What would you...
I'm afraid we are right in the middle of a vikuach. A disputation. You know? Well, as far as the interpretation of the first verse of the Decalogue, Exodus 22, is concerned, well, I spontaneously would be more in favor of the second, well, that's obvious, of the second interpretation, i.e., commands as empowerment, as giving of freedom. As far as the idea of a law shared by God is concerned, I think there is here a deep point of encounter between Christianity and Judaism. I hope it is. That's my opinion. You may not share it. The important point is that the very nature of, let's say, the content of revelation. God does not simply let fall commands from the heavens. He does not simply parachute his will from heaven to earth. He sort of gives a glimpse of what he himself is. And by the way, since you were so nice as to mention that you read my book on the law of God, that's an idea I toyed with in that, comparing the Decalogue with the rules of a house, of a residence, of some resort. You know? When I read, sorry to parodize, to make a parody of the Bible, "Thou shalt not smoke." Thou shalt not let your dog do all kind of untoward things inside of the house and so on. I learned something about the mores of the owner. This is a teaching, Torah. I learned something about, not only about what the owner of the house wants, not only about his will, but about his very being. Of course, you remember that in the Deuteronomy, the law is supposed to have been given on the threshold of the Holy Land, i.e. on the threshold of God's house, so to speak. And the rules of that obtain in the house tell us something about, the main inhabitant of the country, i.e. God himself. You know? God is the kind of fellow who would not kill. He is the kind of fellow who would not steal. He is the kind of fellow who would not, betray his wife if he had any, to be sure. By analogy, we get some knowledge of God's. I use the word mores. You know, that's about God's ways. Perhaps it would be an image, or perhaps a less technical a term. And it's the case that the gift of the commands is not simply a set of rules, how should I put that, well, like the rules that guide the way in which we behave in a car, not, well, trespassing some limits, not going faster than this or that. There's more to that. This is some sort of teaching. Sorry to have to play once again with the word Torah. This is a teaching about God. In the same way as by living in God's country, we sort of get a glimpse of what God is all about. In the same way, when we abide by the commands, we sort of learn something about God. In Islam, to come back to the topic, one gets the impression that the commands are simply let down from the heaven. By the way, that's the word of art for revelation in Arabic. That's descent, tanzil. This comes back from heavens, metaphorically speaking, but we don't get any knowledge of what God is like. And we have even some extreme theologians. Well, I don't like the word theologians, but I can't find anything better for the time being. Some extreme theologians tell us that God could very well have given us commands that express his will but have nothing to do with our good. It is an idea, by the way, that was taken up in late scholasticism, but probably, that's what I feel in my bones at least, probably more as a logical play. What if God commanded us to disobey him? That's wonderful for logicians. Can spend hours on that. But whether this corresponded to any real, questioning to any real research, I would doubt. Anyway, you find these kind of things among some mutakallimun, some theologians, i.e., it could very well be the case that the commands are for our undoing. Why not? If God tells us to do that, we have to stand to attention and to do it, regardless whether this is good for us. Thank goodness there are other people who say, well, God pays attention to the needs of his creatures and so on and so forth. But this is a logical possibility opened up by the very nature of revelation, i.e., drop things and don't enter history. Sorry.
Time for one more question from my Georgetown colleague, Yvonne Haddad.
Yeah, I was just curious why you chose to sort of dwell on one interpretation of the Quranic verses, because in the Quran there are verses that compete with each other, contradict each other, and you can get any message you want out of them. Basically speaking, if you look at the three monotheistic religions, they're all exclusive. The Jewish community believes they are the chosen people. The Christians believe we are the elect. My mother ingrained in me, unless you believe in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, you will never be saved. So there is no salvation outside of Christianity. And as you said, the Muslims believe that in Islam, in the Deen inda Allahi al-Islam, that is a religion with God, is surrender. Or if you want, in the interpretations of the mutakallimun, the theologians, it's al-Islam. But there is this other tradition in the Quran, the verses that they use when we go to dialogue, which are the verses that are interpreted as advocating pluralism. For example, the verse that says, to you your religion and to me mine, that means it recognizes that the Christians and the Jews at the end of time are, وَلَا يَحْزَنُونَ. They shouldn't worry because they're going to go to heaven. So we're not going to judge. The Muslims say God will judge. Then there is that very important verse they use on pluralism, which says that we have created you of tribes and nations that you may know one another. So compete in righteousness, and it's God at the end of time who's going to decide who is the most righteous. So God, by his will, created difference. He wanted to have Christians and Jews and others to compete with each other because there is another verse of the Quran which says very clearly, had God willed, he would have made you one nation. Therefore, it is the will of God that there would be different nations to compete in righteousness. So I was just curious why you chose to ignore that line of reasoning that Muslims use today.
Well, thank you. Well, the reason is quite a simple one, you know. Well, first, to open up the problem, well, there's a great deal of contradictory statements in the Quran. They're not self-contradictory, but I mean there are verses that contradict each other. And, well, the Muslims, well, observed that from the outset. This is so evident. And they had to look for a solution to get off the hook. And they found the following one. A former verse, a verse that was revealed first, can be abrogated by a later one. Abrogate doesn't mean that we simply cross out the verse. You can't do that to God's words. But simply you put its content, its normative content, into brackets. Okay. And well, and for this reason, you'll have to build a legislation only on the latest verses, on the verses that were revealed when the Prophet was in Medina, no longer in Mecca. And there's a whole literature on this theme. The theme of abrogation. There are abrogated verses and abrogating verses. Now, it's the case that the verses that you've just been quoting and that I've heard 1,000 times approximately, quoted by Muslims whose sincerity I have no reason to call into doubt, all those verses were abrogated. In particular, by the single verse that commands to fight against people who associate other beings to God. And there's probably an interpolation, but it's supposed to be part and parcel of the text. You have to fight the people of the book, people who have a sacred book, a previous sacred book, i.e. the Jews and Christians, till they submit and pay the tax, the so-called capitation, it's a special kind of personal tax, in a situation of humiliation, word for word, and they are small. And well, this is no problem, you know, for Islamic dogmatics. Thanks to the idea of abrogation, you can, iron out every apparent contradiction. Another example, you know, a verse from Mecca says, you should not pray while you are intoxicated. A second verse later on says, you should not drink. And a third verse of a late period says, don't drink. No alcohol, no alcohol. And it is clear that the third verse makes the first two null and void. They are still there, they are still read, that their normative content has lost its authority. And I'm afraid that all those verses that advocate pluralism, rivalry in the good, if God had wanted, he would have made of you one community, but, and so on and so forth. I've heard that, well, as I told you 1,000 times. All those verses are abrogated. Well, no, there's another point that I forgot. Oh, yes, about the best community. The verse in which this is said in the Quran is extremely interesting. Well, we discussed that at breakfast, if I'm not mistaken, i.e., the verse says, you are the best community, and God speaks to the small group of early Muslims. You are the best community. You command what is good, and you forbid what is wrong. And well, when I read that, I did not realize at least the paradox. We should have expected you are the best community. You do what is good, and you avoid, you leave alone what is wrong. But then we have, no, you are the best community because you are in power, because you have the power to prevent people from going astray and of compelling them to stay in the right path. Okay, this might be perhaps a way for us to qualify this perhaps too quickly done identification of the three ways in which each community considers to be the best one, which is a human weakness, a common human weakness.